Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, IANDS, for having us this weekend. It's been wonderful so far. Just want to start off by saying that for those of you that think you're going to hear about a near-death experience and about a shared near-death experience and the aftermath of that, you are going to, but we want it to be perfectly clear that this is primarily our love story. That's really what this is all about. So I'm going to share a little bit about what brought me to St. Mary's Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, and then Scarlett's going to share a little bit about what brought her to St. Mary's Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, because that's where we came together for the first time, and then talk a little bit about what it's been like in the past 10 years. So.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say pretty much what David is saying. We're both really delighted to be here, probably a little bit nervous because it's taken 10 years to process what happened, and that's part of what the story is. And so sharing it for the first time in a setting such as this, other than just with friends over coffee who ask invariably, how did you meet? Well, you know, so this is that story, but it's particularly relevant because of the unusual nature of the shared near-death encounter. And I'm not even sure if that's quite the right term, but it's as close as we could find. So David's going to start with what brought him there, as he said, and then we'll just kind of interchange from there. Okay? So take it away.
So I guess the first time that I realized that my household and family was not really 100% normal like other people was when I found myself on the eve of my 8th birthday in a bomb shelter in Golan Heights. It was, you know, interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I got to kiss a girl for the first time that night, my last day of being 7. And also when we woke up the next morning, we all went outside, and the kids were in one bomb shelter and the adults were in another, and we went out, and as we all kind of gathered together on the ground, sort of in the midst of where everybody was sleeping and where the shelters were, there was an unexploded ordnance that had landed during the night. And it may have been at that point that I kind of wondered about my parents, the wiseness of uprooting a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. My dad quit a very good job in San Francisco. We sold the house, gave away the dog, sold the car, and moved to Israel from San Francisco and lived on a kibbutz for 6 months, and then traveled around the country. And that's how we found ourselves in Golan Heights. The rest of my young life was spent sort of getting reacquainted with the idea that I did not have the peaches and cream, the white picket fence home life. My mother was an alcoholic. I became very emotionally shut off, very isolated, trying to protect myself. And by the time I was a late teenager, my mom had quit drinking, come out as a lesbian, and my parents had been separated and married, divorced, and married to other people at that time. So when it came time for me to think about what I was going to take the next step in my life, as I went into the financial services business and started on that career path, when I decided to find a mate and settle down and get married, of course, I picked a daughter of a Unity minister and a home ec teacher with the idea that would slow me down, because I too had accelerated into alcohol abuse and drug abuse, and had gone far down that path even by my mid-20s. And I married a woman who, again, was very straight and narrow, and we eventually had our children in Southern California and moved from Northern California to Southern California for work, and then up to Spokane, Washington, eventually. And this was all for work. This was all because I had a fear of economic insecurity and needed to put food on the table. My first wife never worked from the day that she found out she was pregnant with our first daughter. Never had a desire to or an inclination to. And so in the last 5 years that we were together, I was unemployed for a total of 24 months. And that put a lot of pressure on not just me and but our marriage, certainly. And at the time that we finally divorced, we'd been married for 17 years, and it had been quite unhappy for the majority of those. When I landed in Richmond, Virginia on February 7th, 2005, it was the first time I had set foot in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it was for a job. And I thought, well, I can get a job. Maybe that means that, the marriage will, maybe absence will make the heart grow fonder, but I'll be able to put food on the table. And I, too, was newly sober at this point. I had been sober for just about 9 months. I was and continue to be in a 12-step recovery program that, and I love hearing what some of the people have shared during the sessions this weekend, because so many of the things that I've been able to hear, and it's amazing the similarities in some of people's philosophy and outlook. Meditation is important to me. Prayer is important. Being an example is important to me today. Those things were not important to me 11 years ago, however. But when I got to Richmond, I was working, had a new job, and was early in sobriety. Was still very sick in the head. During my marriage, I had acted very much out of integrity. I had abused drugs and alcohol. I had been unfaithful to my wife. I had lied incessantly to her and to others, and mostly to myself, about where I was, who I was, and what I was doing. And it caused the spiral of the isolation and emotional shutting down just continued to that point. And so when I was in Richmond, Virginia for the first 7 months, I started to get sick progressively. And it started out just as an earache after a long flight back to Spokane, Washington, where my soon-to-be ex-wife and children were. And it progressed over the course of several months to where it was going to necessitate an outpatient surgical procedure. And then just before Labor Day weekend 2005, a few things happened, one of which is the Thursday before the weekend. I couldn't get out of bed when I woke up. I was had a form of paralysis, and I couldn't move. So I called my ear, nose, and throat doctor and asked him what I should do. He said, take 8 Tylenol and see how you feel in 4 or 5 hours. And I'd had other problems. I had other physical problems that had manifested up to this point, but I didn't really know. It was like the boiling frog, as Scarlett loves to put it, that it just kept getting worse, little bit. And so by Friday, I was fine. I decided to take Friday off from work. I figured I could get through the weekend, and Tuesday I could go back to work the day after Labor Day. The calendars coincided at that point 10 years ago, because Saturday the 5th, I woke up, 2005, I woke up feeling a little bit better, but I was in my kitchen that I shared with a friend of mine while I was out in Richmond. My family had not come out yet. They were still back in Spokane. And a few things had happened during the time I was in Richmond. I had started out as a temporary worker and been offered a full-time position at the company that I was working at. And I had accepted that without talking to my wife. So I just didn't think that was really too important to discuss it with her. So that kind of tells you that my head was not anywhere where it needed to be. I was sick in body and sick in mind. I was trying to work a 12-step recovery program, but that was not going very well because I was still living out of integrity. I was still being unfaithful to my wife. I was still not working the steps of the recovery program as I knew them needed to be in order to get healthy, in order to get better, in order to start on that path of recovery. I didn't do that. So that Saturday, September 5th, 2005, I woke up and turned on the radio that was out in the kitchen and listened to the NPR radio stories on the morning edition. And as you may imagine, 10 years ago today, it was the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and there was a man on there that they were interviewing, and he was telling the story about how he was going around in his little boat and picking people up off the roofs of their homes and taking them to safety. And they were hailing him as a hero, basically, on the radio, but he was just telling his story in a very matter-of-fact way. And something at that point snapped for me, and I started breaking down and crying sobbing at the kitchen table. And it was at that moment that I thought that maybe there was something a little more than just an ear infection or something going on. And I happened to live very close by to a Catholic hospital, St. Mary's Hospital in Richmond, and I was 2 blocks away. So I put on my sandals and my sneakers, or my sandals and my shorts, and I walked over to the hospital and checked myself into the ER room. And I said, I can't breathe, I'm having heart palpitations, and I can't breathe. I think maybe I'm having a panic attack. I don't know. And the nurse looked at me and she kind of took my vitals and she said, well, I think you're having a panic attack too. I'm going to check you in. So she checked me in that Saturday, and that was, I got into I'm told that I was awake the following day as well, but I do not remember that. That was the last thing I remember before going into a coma. And I was in that coma for 3.5 weeks. During that time, I do not recall much at all when I was there. The first thing that I shared when I did wake up finally, and I'm going to stop in a second, but the first thing that I did share when I woke up was that I had a feeling of peace and well-being. I was not in any sort of pain or distress and I'll tell you, I didn't know what that meant until coming here and hearing some of the wonderful stories that I've heard this weekend, because I was, unlike my beloved bride, I am not a scholar I was not a seeker or scholar of these types of experiences prior to what happened to me. I had no idea that was a common experience. And most of the people around me didn't know that. None of the people around me knew that either. So they just kind of, would nod their head and go, okay, yeah, whatever. But I had never met Scarlett before. I had a group of friends that, unbeknownst to both of us, they were mutual friends of ours. And that was as far as it went. But we had not had any contact with each other, and we did not know each other. And I was in the hospital in a coma through September 23rd, was when Scarlett came to the hospital. And I'll let her tell you that story about how she came to my hospital room. Okay.
I think also just give a little background about me too, about how I ended up in that hospital room that day. One of the things at that time in my life, I was in a doctoral program in public policy and administration. I was a single mom of 2 boys who had disabilities. My oldest son had severe ADHD. When he was born, he'd had birth trauma. He was a blue baby, and it was pretty tough from then on. And he was in special ed from kindergarten on, and we'd had a really brutal time. My second son had epilepsy, so both boys were struggling. My marriage at that time imploded from the stress of everything, and given my oldest son's disabilities that were so extreme and volatile behavior, my ex-husband and I lived 3 miles apart. I had my older son, he had our younger son, and that's how we co-parented to do this. My background, I had grown up also in an alcoholic home. We had a lot of parallels in our experiences. My parents were very, very young when they were married and had 3 children back to back, for which they were not very prepared. My mother was a career nurse, very loving, wonderful woman, and my father also was a wonderful person in his own way, but I now know that he probably struggled from untreated depression that he used alcohol to help with. And the results were pretty devastating for us as children. That said, we spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house, and from a young age, I was out of my body. I had experiences that I didn't know other people didn't have from the time earliest recollection is being 3 years old and just floating down the steps at my grandparents'. And they didn't think that was so unusual. My grandfather was Native American and English, so out-of-body and spiritual experiences were a norm. My grandmother was Pennsylvania Dutch, so again, this was normal for her. When someone in the house or someone in the family died, there would be a rap of knocks, 3 knocks on a door, and we knew. That's how she always knew. That was the communication method. So I grew up understanding and accepting that this was there were normal or different ways of communicating and different realms, and I just accepted it until I was about 8 or 9 years old when I realized, oh, this is not how the rest of the world functions. And I also remember just being very young, at also around 3 or 4 years old, and I would feel this sense of love that was so powerful I couldn't contain it. It would just be like my whole body would shake with it. And I just remember that innocence, that love, and growing up the way that we did, somehow all of that went away. So as I grew up, where I found my saving grace was in school. It was the one place where I could find stability, a place that wasn't chaotic. So that said, I dropped out my first attempt at college. I had my son, and life was pretty tough for me. I didn't make good choices. Growing up the way that I didn't set me up for having great relationships. So by the time that I met David, as I said, I was a single mom in school, and I had given up on relationships. I just figured my whole experience was going to be focused on helping my children to be as well as they could be, and just trying to keep a roof over our head. It was always a struggle financially, and that's just the way it was. And so that said, because of my children, I had studied alternative healing methods, Reiki, laying on of hands that were taught biblically, all kinds of religions. My mother taught therapeutic touch at the hospital where she was. There was healing touch. All of it was different forms of energy work. So I studied that. I'd love to be able to tell you that I was able to heal my children, but that did not happen. My oldest son is really a miracle. I mean, he is doing really well, but my youngest still has epilepsy. And I have come to understand from these experiences that there are some illnesses people choose for their own spiritual growth, and that healing doesn't mean that the symptoms or the illnesses often go away. Both boys are doing incredibly well, as I said, and to me, that's the healing. Those are huge backstories, and we'll save that for another day. But that's where I was in my life when this happened. I had many friends in recovery programs because all of us had gone through so much in our lives with just various difficulties. And at one time, when I was feeling very depressed, being in that mother role, I felt I was drinking too much wine. I found myself drinking a whole bottle of wine, and I was getting concerned. And I went to a few 12-step meetings and realized, well, no, maybe I don't fit that, but it's not doing me any favors. So I quit, and that was that. But I still respected what people were doing and had some good friends in the program. So I would keep in contact, but when I was busy with school, I dropped out of everything. Well, out of the blue, there were 2 people that I had kept in contact, and I heard from them, and they were both telling me about this friend of theirs, David, whom they'd met, and how what a great guy he was, and he had all of a sudden gotten very ill, and as we were talking over a course of a few weeks, they were telling me that now he was in the hospital from an ear infection, and now he was on life support, and his lungs had shut down, and he was on a ventilator, and now he was his kidneys had shut down, and he was dying. And his mother had been called to come into town for the 3rd time, and that was it. And so they were having a meeting with her and bringing food, and so I went to be supportive with my friends because this was obviously someone that they cared about, and I cared about my friends. So when I showed up that night, I met David's mother. There she is, Dee. And there was something about her that touched my heart so deeply. She was very stoic, and she was thanking everybody for showing such love to her son, whom she had always felt had not had the love. She'd always, as every mother knows, you feel guilty no matter how good you are. But she felt particularly guilty because of all the things that had happened in their lives. And people that I knew and hadn't seen were standing there crying because David had taken the turn for the worst, and they told her, she said that she had signed the funeral directives that day, and they didn't expect him to make it through the night. At this point, he'd been in the coma, and multi-system organ failure. His lungs had shut down. He'd had a chest tube inserted. His kidneys had completely failed, and now his brain had not had enough oxygen, so there was brain damage, they suspected, and that there might also be shutting down on that too. So it was really bad, awful. So I wanted to say to her, I was getting ready to leave, and I wanted to say something comforting like, oh, gee, I'm really sorry for what's happening. But when I went up to her, I felt like a little push on my back, and it's still kind of hard to describe. And what came out of my mouth was, I don't think you should give up hope yet. So and my mind, my rational mind is, what did you just say? Have you lost your mind? This woman's looking at me like I have 3 heads, and you can see she's got a very sweet face, but she's just told everybody that he's not going to make it. And I don't, to this day, know why I said it. I was so broke I could barely even put gas in my car to make it to class and to teach. I was teaching at the college also part-time as a teaching assistant, and also teaching a class, ironically, marriage and family relationships. I had gotten that job because I told the Department of Sociology, I said, well, I've made every mistake you can, so I can tell them at least what not to do. So he hired me to teach the class. So I was doing that at Virginia Commonwealth University, and again, I was broke and struggling, but there was something about her, Mama D, I later came to call her, that just touched my heart. And I told her, I said, you know, if it were my son here, I have done some work in energy work, and if he's ready to cross over, I would be honored to maybe just go hold his hand. I said, I do some energy work, and if you'd like me to go see him with the unspoken, if he's still here, tomorrow, I will, but because he's in the critical care unit, you'll have to give permission. And she said, well, he's Jewish. And I said, well, I figured with a name like Schwartz, I think she was worried I'd press a cross in his chest. And I said, no, don't. It's pretty non-denominational. It's very respectful. And so I said, it's Reiki. And I said, I've trained in all kinds of things, but it's really the healing power of love. And so I said, if you want me to go see him, I will. So she said, if he's still there, will you? So that night, I woke up in the middle of the night, and again, I had never met David, and I felt a presence in my room. And I felt the energy of it being David, even though we, again, had not met. And I was like, oh, I guess it's too late. I feel like maybe he's already gone on. And I called the hospital to find out if he was still alive, and they said he was. So long story short, I went to the hospital. They had a mix-up. My name was not on the list, and then all of a sudden they let me in anyway. And I went in, and I had never seen anybody except my father, who had died. He was on a respirator. He'd had a heart attack, was revived after 45 minutes, and was on a ventilator, and then subsequently died. But I had never been, when I have done healing work, and I've had some dramatic experiences with other people, so this was not a first in that regard, but never seen anyone that sick. So this is not David, because no one had any pictures, but this is a picture of a UK TV show of someone on life support. So when I walked into that room, I have never seen anyone in acute kidney failure, so I didn't know that their whole bodies swell, and he was swollen. And I could not see his face because he had a feeding tube in his nose. He had the ventilator tube in his mouth. It had almost looked like duct tape to hold the tube in place. There was a central line in his neck. He had IV lines here. He had all kinds of things on his chest. He had a dry catheter bag because, again, the kidneys had shut down and were not producing any urine. He had, one of the friends said that he had 20 bags hanging off of him. He'd already had 22, excuse me, but who's counting? So he'd had 2 blood transfusions, and they'd only recently figured out what had happened. I just wanted to go, I know we have doctors and clinicians in the room, and I wanted to just give you a little bit of the medical course that he went through so you'll understand how significant this was. Because there is, I'll say, there's no medical explanation why David is alive today. This is pretty much when he went in. These were the diagnoses, as you can see. We ended up having 12. There might have been 13 consults, but I could only find 12 records. You can kind of see what they were trying to think might be going on. Again, no one knew. Down here we go, and then they, on the 7th, he was in acute respiratory failure and had to do the emergency intubation. And it went on down. He was critically ill. All of these things, they tested for Legionnaires, AIDS, anything, all kinds of things. They had no idea what was going on. His heart was out of rhythm, so he's in AFib. Again, the severe respiratory failure, all these things. Then acute renal failure went on, sepsis, the complete respiratory failure. They had to do the chest tube. I forgot if that's is that up or down? Anyway, no, I think that keeps going. Well, it just got worse and worse. You can kind of see that, on the 17th, they had to insert a chest tube because he wasn't getting enough oxygen. Then his heart went into atrial fibrillation, and then he had respiratory failure post-chest tube. So the whole course was just brutal. By the 19th, this is pretty much where David was, and his mother had been called to be on standby, and they had finally figured out that David had what they called then Wegener's granulomatosis, which is a very rare form of vasculitis that cuts off the blood supply to organs. And it also does a lot of other pretty horrible things. But, again, this is classic for the course of Wegener's, and, that was it. And even though they had finally figured it out, and implemented the protocol for the treatment, it was too late. David didn't respond. And this is what they did. He also had clots. They gave him heparin, and they nearly died in addition to that from an allergic reaction to the heparin. So there he is. This is a little ahead of it. I met Dee, his mother, on September 22nd. I went into the hospital on September 23rd. So when I walked in and saw this bloated man who looked more like a thing than a human being on that bed, and I wondered why I was even there. I didn't even know what I could possibly do for this person that I didn't even know. So here's my rational mind going. But my mother had always told me whenever anyone is in a coma, they can hear you. And whether they're in their body, out of their body, you need to be very, very careful what you say. So I remembered that. And I realized we really had never met. So I walked up to him and I said, my name is Scarlett, and I'm here because I met your mother last night, and I met a lot of people who really seem to love you. And I'm here because if I can do something that might help you, if you've decided that you want to leave this life, I want you to know that it's okay. But if you decide that maybe you're not quite done, that you have some unfinished business, if you'd like me to work with you, I would be honored to do that. And I told him, I said, I know that you think I can't hear you, but I can. And I'm going to stand here, and you are in charge. This is your experience. And if you want me to work with you, you need to give me your permission. And I will hear you whether you want me to or not. So I stood there, and again, David was completely unresponsive, and I felt a little puff of air, and it didn't come from the machine. And so I took that as a yes. So I walked up to him, and I said, if it's okay with you, I'm going to take your hand. So he had the monitor on the finger, and I took his hand very carefully, and in that moment, my heart opened to such complete compassion. And all of a sudden, I felt as though I had seen somebody that I used to know, and I was seeing them in terrible shape, and it was, oh my God, what has happened to you? Now, this is not someone I knew, but this is how I felt. And then I was overwhelmed. I felt waves of grief, and I felt waves of shame, and I felt all these waves of just heavy pain from him. And we had connected. And again, I felt that compassion. And I felt that sense of unconditional love washing through me. This is not the experience, mind you. This is just the beginning phase. So I asked his permission to continue on. I told him everything I was going to do. If I needed to touch any area of his arms or his legs or whatever, I said, here's what I'm doing. Is this okay? And of course, he didn't respond in any way that we would accept, but I continued on. And I finished, I didn't feel much energy from him. I just felt the sorrow. And normally when I work with somebody, I can feel tingles, jags, you can feel all kinds of different energies, sparkles, just different energy fields. But David was very flat. And so I said to him, I said, I know you have a choice to make, you know, whether you're going to leave or go, and I know you're right at that edge. And I said, but I'll tell you what, whatever you do decide, there's nothing but love for you. There is nothing that you have ever done or could have ever done that would separate you from being loved, and you need to know that. And I felt some of that shame begin to lift. And I was getting ready to leave, and I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to make you a deal. If you decide that you want to stick around, I promise you I will come back. And if you don't, then that's okay. Then just go and love. And so I took his hand, and I was getting ready to leave, and all of a sudden, my hand was fused to his. He had no grip. It's not as though he grabbed my hand back. And if I'd yanked hard, I could have taken my hand away. But I realized from a spiritual level, he was reaching back. So I just stood there for a moment, and then I kind of laughed, and I said, oh, you don't want me to leave? And I said, okay. So I stood there, and I said, okay, so I'll pray with you. So I prayed again, and a lot of people were asking about religion. I knew that David was Jewish, and I'm very respectful of anybody's faith system because I see it as a system. Love is love. But I had been raised in Christian churches, so I prayed to Jesus in the car before I went in so I could be grounded in that, and also did the Reiki, which is non-religious. But I felt like I needed every force in the universe. And my prayer was to the God of my understanding, which was a miracle-working God. And any force for his highest and best in the universe that was only the most sacred, most holy, and let it go at that. So I said my prayer, and I told David if he was alive the next day I'd come back. Well, he was. So what happened was I continued to come back. On the fifth day, on the third day, he started to respond. He started to show, it's kind of gross, but, you know, he had urine in his bag, his catheter bag. That's a big deal. And the nurses were shocked that this was happening. So I continued working with him, and on the fifth day is when we had what I can only call as a shared near death. And I think part of it was because I'm used to having some experiences, but I had never experienced anything like this. I was holding his hand. I had started doing the healing work with him, and as I took his hand and stood there, and I always started with a prayer, again with that same prayer, all of a sudden I was not in my body. All of a sudden I was holding his hand in another dimension, and he was standing up, and I saw they had brown eyes. I didn't even know what color eyes he had because they had been closed the whole time. And he was standing there, and I was standing there in this dimension. There wasn't a tunnel, but it was the closest thing I can call it were this, because it was like dots of light. It was like particles of light, and it was like liquid. It was not liquid. It was like we were of it, and we were separate from it. And people talk about love, and when I talk about love, I know there's all kinds of love. There's parental love, there's parent-child love, there's friend love, there's romantic love, there's spiritual love, unconditional love. We've heard all that. This kind of love was like all of that kinds of love combined times something I had never even known. And I knew in that moment that I had always known this man, and he had always known me. I knew in this moment that I loved this man, and he'd always loved me. But I didn't know what kind of love. At least I wasn't even thinking about that. I just knew, and I was aware that we were surrounded in a bubble of love, and that somehow we had gotten linked up together. And I didn't know more than that, except it was so profound, and we were there together. And then the next thing I know, I'm plopped back in my body, standing there at his hospital bed, wondering what happened. And he is still not awake. He's still unresponsive, but he's getting better. And my mind is blown because I didn't know that kind of love existed. Nothing quite like that. And so I continued working with him, and on the sixth day, the ventilator tube came out, and he began to breathe on his own. So each day, and I came back, By that weekend, though, he'd had a relapse, and then his brain, they said, was shutting down. So I asked the nurses to put music, headphones on him, and just play some music, classical, soft music, so that just to keep his brain stimulated. And they did, and I came twice a day and continued working with him. And he pulled through that time. And then I worked with him for a total of 12 days. But we also had some unusual experiences, and this is the first time I've ever talked about them publicly, and I'm only going to talk about it because people asked about it. When at one point when David was really sick, I think this was the 7th or 8th day, I was in my bedroom at night. I had worked with him twice that day, and I was tired. It had taken a lot out of me, just holding that much energy, because it wasn't just me giving energy. We were wrapped up. The energy was circulating through each of us, and I was getting just as much energetic healing, and my body was shaking with it. I could not contain all the energy that was coming through me to him and circling back. It was, and I'd never had that experience where we were circulating it together. It was almost like it was a human circulating machine with him, and he was also healing me. It was, it's still having the words for this. But when I'd gone in that day, the nurses were saying, well, he's doing great, but his kidneys, not so good. They had done a dialysis treatment that day, and they said, well, even if he survives this, which now it looked like he might, he would have permanent kidney damage because it had been so extreme. And I made a joke. I said, well, I'll work on his kidneys. And, you know, they laughed, we laughed, and I did my little work. And but that night, I all of a sudden felt transported to his room, and I saw a team of doctors, that's all I can describe, and they looked bluish to me. They were they were not human. I don't know what they were, and I don't know, they just had a bluish tinge, and they were actually replacing his kidneys in a surgical procedure. I know it sounds completely crazy, and that's why I haven't talked about it for 10 years, because I doubted it, but I know it, and I know that, and that experience, I was out of my body in his room, and there were 4 of them, two on each side and one at the end, and the one who was doing the actual work, and it was almost like they dropped in healthy kidneys. And I looked at them, and they looked at me, and their moves were choppy and bird-like, and it's hard to describe, and they nodded, and poof, I was back in bed. And I thought, well, this is just I must be dreaming a lucid dream, or I kind of woke up. Except that I went back to the hospital the next day, and his kidneys were fully functioning. So there was no explanation for that. And I was like, well, okay, whatever, who knows? So I'm reading, trying to find, I'm a researcher at heart. Okay, blue people, what does that mean? Blue angels, phantom medical teams, whatever, holographic organs downloads, I don't know. So I couldn't find any explanation. As you can probably guess, I've walked in 2 worlds most of my life. That doesn't mean it's been easy. And that's probably why I chose very mainstream, very boring, if not boring, but public policy's not, not going to jump anyone out of their seat, I can say that. But I did it really to help my children. I wanted to change things. I wanted to make this world a better place, and helping kids get better services, one of the reasons I did it, and that was also the reason I went for my master's in public health, to become a better researcher and understand how research is done in a correct way. And I'd also had presented a paper right shortly before I met David on the power of love, and by the development of the 6th sense as a human race, and a conference on anti-terrorism in Istanbul. So that was part of what I was looking at. How can we get to love? How can we get to love? So anyway, when I was working with David, I had not met him. I really didn't know anything about him. And I told him that if he wanted me to stick around, I'd continue to come back. And I worked with him for 12 days. On the 11th day, his then wife came to town, and I prayed with her. She told me they had been estranged for several years and been fighting like cats and dogs, and that the marriage was on the fritz, basically. And I said, sometimes when these things happen, this can help heal a marriage. This can help bring things together and help you realize what's important. And I had wondered why she had not been there, which struck me as a little odd. You know, I'm sure if my husband lay dying in another state, I might have shown up more than once or twice, but I knew that something was seriously wrong. So I did everything too. For the healers in the room, I used tuning forks, because even though he was having these things, I used the key of G for a tuning fork to use him to calibrate things. I used aromatherapy. I used essential oils on his feet, because I had studied omega-3s for my children and knew that you need that. You're deprived when you're down that long on so I was doing also foot reflexology points, music. So you name it, I was pulling out every stop I knew in addition to prayer. So I was trying to show his ex-wife where to put the oil on the feet, and she said, "Oh, no, I don't want to touch him." And I said, "Okay, well, then I'll continue." But I just said a prayer for her, and then that moment I knew that I came back the next day, and that was day 12, and I said to him, he was awake then, his eyes were open, but he was very confused, still very sick, and I said, the words that came out of my mouth were, "The portal has closed," and I knew that he was done, that he was back. And I said, "You're going to be up on your feet the next day." And his eyes were very large, and normally, and if you've worked with patients who have been down that long, you know they've lost muscle tone. Standing is going to be very difficult. But he was up on his feet the next day. And so to me, I had done my job. I had experienced this profound love. It was not romantic love. It was just love, love in its most purest essence. And what I met, the person I met, I saw him in his pure essence. And that's what I loved. I loved that innocence, that purity of his spirit. And that's how we met. Then he opened his eyes, and he didn't know me. And and he didn't know me at all. So I'd met him 3 times. 1 when he's unconscious, 2 in another realm, and 3 when he's meeting me for his first conscious experience. And it was very awkward. And so that's how we came to meet. And I'm going to turn it over to David.
Yeah, so that's how we came to meet. One thing I did know when I woke up, although I had no memory of what Scarlett just described, other than that sense of peace and well-being, and I had no idea how long I had been down or what had happened. But the first thing that I remember seeing when I woke up was Scarlett, and knew that I was instantly in love. And here was my angel floating around the room, playing with the music, bringing me food, doing these things, and I just had such an overwhelming feeling of love and affection and just outpouring to her that I did not understand. And it wasn't made any better by the fact that one of my friends who had spent many hours and days in the hospital room with me knew Scarlett from before, and had just basically said, when I asked, he said, "Oh, that's Scarlett." Like I was supposed to know who this was, because he had known her prior to this happening. When I came to, and the doctor, my nephrologist came by to see me on a daily basis. Every day he came by, and he gave me my percentage of kidney function. And every day it was 5 to 10% better. And finally, when I was about at 65 or 85% or something like that, I don't remember exactly, he said, "Well, now we need to get you out of here, Mr. Schwartz, so you can get away from all these sick people." And so as September turned October, mid-October, they were going to transfer me to a rehab unit. And the doctor who was going to approve me to go to the rehab center came by the night before just to look me over one last time, and he said, "I don't think we're going to do that." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're making too much of an improvement for me to recommend you for rehab." And understand, this was only like a few days prior that he had recommended. So instead, I got to go home the next day. I believe that was the 16th or 17th of...
If you want to just tell them, so. I got so excited in my story, I forgot to hit my slide. Just so people can know, Wegener's is now not called Wegener's any longer. It's now Granulomatosis with polyangiitis, and they said that they changed that name because Wegener apparently was a Nazi sympathizer or whatever, so we heard. So we still say Wegener's because that's what it was diagnosed as at that time. But you can see this is a description, pretty much. Damage to the lungs and kidneys can be fatal, and 20 years ago it used to be completely fatal. And even now, it requires long-term immunosuppression. They treat it like cancer because David was put on Cytoxin and prednisone and a bunch of other medications. But when he was discharged, this is kind of it too, so you can see that. All right.
Yeah, there it is.
Go ahead. All right.
So I got discharged. I went back to my apartment, and shortly thereafter, an anonymous donor granted me a ticket to go back to the West Coast to see my family. 'Cause I'm from San Francisco. My family was in San Francisco, and my wife and kids were up in Spokane, Washington, Eastern Washington State. So I flew back to San Francisco. I was walking through the airport with my cane, barely able to get 10 or 20 steps without having to stop and take a breath. But I knew that I needed to see my family. So I went back, spent a week with my mom, a week with my dad, or a week with my mom and dad in their different places, because they lived just a few miles apart. And then after a week in San Francisco, I flew up to Spokane, Washington to see my wife and kids. During the time I'd been sick, a number of things had happened. My wife had come out when I regained consciousness and had me scratch an X, granting her power of attorney. She cleaned the bank account that we shared out with all the money. Also, during that time, she had moved to another home, one I'd never seen before, put all of my personal items into a storage unit, and moved the girls to another house. So when I showed up in Spokane, this is mid-November, yes, mid-November of 2005. Again, still very weak and still sick. I walked into the front door of this house I'd never seen before, stopped at the counter to sort of catch my breath and compose myself before seeing my daughters for the first time in several months. And there was a knock on the front door, and a friend of hers came in and handed me the divorce papers. So that was actually a relief, given how bad things had been even before I got sick. So we sat our girls down, who were 8 and 12 at the time, told them what was happening, and didn't really tell them a lot about what had happened to Dad as far as being sick. And they knew that I was sick, but they didn't know just how bad it was, just how close I had come to not being there. And when I came, so I stayed there for a week, spent time with my daughters. And when I came back to Richmond, Virginia, I saw Scarlett the day after I got home, and the first thing I said was, "Kiss me, I've got divorce papers." And that was a Thursday night, and from that weekend on, we have been together since then. That was November of 2005. We got married in June of 2006, and we've been together ever since then. And Scarlett will tell you shortly, I know we only have about 10 minutes, Scarlett will tell you shortly about how strange that was for her to be in that situation, but it was an absolute miracle for me. I fully believe, and I know in my heart today, that the reason that I got sick and went as far down as I went was because my body was given up. I had been living out of congruity and outside of any values that I had ever pretended to have for so long that my body just said, that's it. They do not know today what causes Wegener's granulomatosis. There's not a known cause. It's not specifically viral. It's not specifically bacteriological. I know that the reason that I got that sickness and that illness and just about didn't come back was because my body was telling me, you've got to make some changes. And I have made some changes. One of the biggest changes is that I now have a relationship with a woman who is the smartest, funniest, most amazing person that I've ever met in my life. And I'm very, very fortunate to have Scarlett as as a friend, much less as my wife. That's a miracle, because I had spent so many years just knowing that there was not going to be a happy ending for me. And that looked like what was going to happen until that miracle occurred. People talk about having a ministry. My ministry today is to try and be a good example for other people and other men specifically. I take recovery meetings into institutions, mental hospitals, mental facilities, prisons, jails, because those are the people that most of mainstream world has forgotten about. And they're people who are just like me and just took a wrong turn somewhere just like I did, and they had a much different result than I did. And that's what I do today. It has not been an easy 10 years, I can tell you that. We've had struggles. We've had financial struggles. I had to pay alimony and child support for it. Paid alimony for 3 years, child support for 10. Had $750,000 in medical bills that had to be accounted for. Fortunately, the people that I worked for enabled me to have health insurance, and I was able to whittle that down a little bit. But Scarlett, who is a money master guru, was able to help me with that and to get to a point where I could get those paid down. But that's the reality. I had to go back to work. I went back to work in December of 2005. I was barely walking on my own at that point, but my ex-wife, bless her, she drew up the divorce papers with two scenarios, one that I was 100% healthy and one that I was on disability, just in case, my kidneys never did get better. That's just the reality for us. And so today I am just incredibly grateful that we've had an opportunity like this to come and share our story with all of you wonderful people, and mostly to hear some of, Anita this morning and Suzanne and just everybody. It's just been incredible. I feel like I've come home, I really do. I didn't know anything about this journey and about what this really meant until I got to meet and spend time with all you people. It's been just an honor and a privilege, and I thank you so much. I'm going to have Scarlett have the last word. Thank you.
He's learned well. This is, today.
Yeah, that's me today.
Today, again, the normal treatment for Wegener's is a lifelong medication. The only medication David's on is fish oil and vitamin B12 and vitamin C and love. Everything is normal. Everything is back to functioning. Even though he had a miracle, the illness was so devastating, it did take time, probably 2 years before David was fully back on his feet. The only main thing, residual, was deafness in his left ear, and I say that's convenient because he can tell me he didn't hear what I said when.
What?
So as you can probably tell, we laugh a lot, and also this wasn't about me just going in and healing David. This was David's choice to come back. I look at myself as a healing facilitator, and also I got healed too because I had been pretty sad in my life, and it was really hard being a broke single mom. When David says I'm a financial guru, that means I learned how to pinch pennies till they bled, so to say. And we both work in financial services today. I had thought that I was called to be a healer, and I realized that I am, but what this experience taught me was that my healing setting is in a clinic or a hospital, although I do volunteer work, and we've had several major recoveries as dramatic as what happened with David. So I know the gift is there, and it is more enhanced. But I've chosen to use my healing gifts in the corporate world because there's a lot of walking wounded people there. I'm a senior manager, which means that I have the opportunity, the privilege, and the responsibility to help people be successful. I've seen in corporate America, there's a lot of bad management, a lot of people who get in a position of management and they abuse people or their position. I've seen it too much, and I thought this is a place where I can do some healing, where I can make a difference. And every day I walk in there and I see the people that I'm responsible for. I have 17, 18 people coming aboard on my team, and I can see their essence. I can see their spirit, and that's how I deal with them, as spirits. I don't look at them as, oh, I'm the boss. I look at them as we're in this together. How can we make our life together while we're here in this place, spending at work, where most of us spend a lot of our time, more than we do with our families? How can I make this as pleasant, as supportive, as helpful to them as I possibly can? How can I show them love? And every day I go in and I say a prayer of, let me be love today. Let me be love in the workforce. Does that mean there aren't politics or irritable days or things falling apart? There sure are, but I don't have to be in it. What I can be is hold that love, and it has been a miracle. And I also know that that's where my higher power wanted me, because I didn't even apply for the job. They recruited me out of LinkedIn, out of the blue, and for an operations management position, and that's the kind of job David had had. And I told him, I said, I think they asked for the wrong Schwartz. And he said, go anyway. So I did. And I've heard a lot of people say that it's hard to work in the work field, but we didn't have much choice. We had 4 children between us. They all needed health insurance. They all needed a lot of stuff, braces, life. You know, kids are expensive. And even though it was very jarring to be in the workforce, we had to do it. So that's where I'm supposed to be right now. From the things that we've learned in David's experience and our experience together, we know unequivocally that the only thing is love. That is it. And anything else that's not love. And the other thing is, I hear a lot of people say, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. They're unhappy where they are. And I see this all the time, and I went through that too. I even opened a healing practice and then didn't feel good about it. And I was like, oh, you know, wherever we are is where we're supposed to be for that time. And until it changes, it will change. And now I have that peace and the contentment, and we are happy. So I was like, who knew that this could happen?
I think this young man wants to answer a question.
Okay.
Ask a question.
Oh, and finally, this is David's painting. He just painted this earlier this year of the portal, he calls it. That's what he's having memories now coming back, and it's taken 10 years, but now he's remembering what happened. I've had to be patient and just let him know I'm really a saint, but he doesn't believe me. No, he still leaves dirty socks, and I still, you know, whatever. But anyway, go ahead. You had a question?
Yes. Thank you very much for your story. And I wanted to comment on the team of bluish beings replacing the kidneys. The other shared near-death experience that I'm aware of, I'm a researcher, is one I mentioned, Jan Price and her husband, John Price. She had a cardiac arrest in her home, and the EMTs were there, and they were working on her. He saw her leave her body, and then saw also their deceased dog Maggie go with her. And but then he saw, and I didn't mention this when I mentioned the story, he saw 3 or 4, I can't remember the number, of spiritual beings working on her body, on her heart, with EMTs, or, you know, in the same area. And I wouldn't say that that's so unusual, actually. And if you think about, all of our organs are not only physical but also energetic. And so when there is a physical problem, it can be handled, it can be healed energetically. Well, of course, you know Reiki, so yes. But each organ has its own energy pattern, and so it would not be at all improbable that they were replacing the energetic, the etheric aspect of the kidneys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Oh, do you have one more question? Yeah.
We have 1 minute.
Okay, in 1 minute, I just wondered, David, how are your children doing, and are you close with them, and do they understand anything about this?
I have told them the story. They're 18 and 22, and they're doing wonderfully. They will learn more. They know enough now. They also know that even though I'm not able to be with them every day and be a part of their lives on every day, the fact that I talk to them regularly and I see them once or twice a year is a lot better than what the alternative could have been. So it's a good thing. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.